After my dad passed away, I thought I was prepared for the worst. I expected the grief to hit hard, and it did, but I was sure I'd be able to manage it over time. What I wasn't ready for was the gut punch that came next. My stepmom, Janet, whom I'd never been particularly close to, suddenly seemed to think she had the right to take control of everything. Everything that was mine, including the house my dad had left me. Janet and I never had much of a relationship. She was never the warm, loving figure that other people's stepmoms seemed to be. In fact, she was the exact opposite. She always kept to herself, maintaining this air of indifference that made it clear she wasn't interested in being a mom to me. She was my dad's wife, and that was it. I respected that, even though we never had much in common. I didn't mind her cold distance because, honestly, I had enough love and attention from my dad to feel secure. But when my dad passed away unexpectedly, everything changed. I expected Janet to fade into the background, you know? It's not like she was a part of our real family dynamic. My dad and I had our routines, our little things, and I figured she'd just be the widow who mourned and life would move on. Instead, she stepped up in ways I wasn't prepared for, ways that didn't sit right with me. She seemed more concerned with taking charge of things than actually grieving. The way she was acting, it just felt off. But I brushed it aside, thinking I was just being paranoid. That was until the day I went to the lawyer's office. I was expecting it to be a simple meeting, just some paperwork to sign, a few details to sort out, and I'd be on my way. But when the lawyer handed me a document, I felt my stomach drop. Janet had somehow managed to change everything. The house, the one my dad had specifically left to me, was now part of a bigger claim she was making. She had made sure that the will seemed ambiguous enough to fit her version of things. She was arguing that, as his wife, she was entitled to the property. I was in shock. How could she just take something that wasn't hers, something my dad had clearly intended for me? I never even saw it coming. She was sitting there, playing the grieving widow to perfection, acting like she had the right to everything. But there was a coldness in her eyes, a hint of something calculating. That was the moment I realized she thought I didn't know what was going on. She thought I wouldn't fight back. And I'll be honest with you, I almost let her get away with it. But something inside me snapped. I wasn't going to let her walk all over me. My dad had left that house to me, and I was going to make sure she regretted ever thinking she could take it from me. Looking back, it wasn't hard to see the signs that Janet never truly considered me family. It wasn't that she was outwardly cruel. No, she wasn't that obvious. But it was in the small things, the way she would always choose her own comfort over any kind of connection with me. She made sure to distance herself in every way possible, and I started to feel like an outsider in my own home. It wasn't that she disliked me, but there was always this unspoken barrier between us. She was my dad's wife, but nothing more. When they got married, I was still in high school, and I remember feeling like I had no say in the matter. Dad had always been my rock, the one constant in my life, and I was pretty upset when he introduced her to me. I wasn't ready to share him, and I wasn't ready to have someone else dictate how things would run in our home. But I tried, for his sake, to be polite. I tried to accept her, even though she never really made the effort to accept me. She never reached out, never tried to include me in their little family moments, and she never showed any interest in my life outside of the occasional "how's school going?" question, which always felt more like a formality than a real inquiry. But I dealt with it. I had my own life, and I wasn't about to let a cold stepmom affect my relationship with my dad. Over the years, I found ways to work around her. She had her space, and I had mine. And for the most part, it was fine. But the deeper problem was that it wasn't just the lack of warmth that bothered me. It was how she seemed to feel entitled to things she had no real claim to. Every time my dad and I got close or did something special, she'd throw in some passive comment about how she deserved more, or how things should be different now that we were a family. That's when I started realizing that she saw me as more of a nuisance than a daughter. But what hurt the most was that my dad never really seemed to see it. He'd brush it off, telling me she was just a little different and had her own way of doing things. But when Dad got sick, that was when things started to go downhill. I remember him sitting me down one afternoon, looking frail and exhausted, and asking me to promise that I'd look out for myself after he was gone. I thought he was just talking about the usual stuff, how to manage life, finances, all that. But it was when he started talking about the house and his investments and everything he had worked for over the years that I realized how serious he was. He wanted me to have everything. He wanted me to be secure, even after he was gone. He told me that I'd be the one to carry on the legacy of the family. His words were clear, but they were more than just words. They were his final wish. What struck me the most was when he specifically told me to take care of the house. It had been in the family for generations, and he said it was mine. He knew that once he was gone, Janet would want to take over everything. He didn't say it outright, but I could tell he was worried. He trusted me to protect it. But I had no idea that after his death, Janet would go behind my back and try to claim it as her own. And when I discovered the will, it wasn't just about the house, it was about everything my dad had worked for, everything that meant something to him. Janet had somehow managed to get the lawyer to overlook key parts of the will, and she was acting like she had more rights than I did. It was as though she was erasing my dad's entire legacy, and all I could do was sit there, shocked, while she manipulated the situation. That was when I realized how far she'd go. She wasn't just playing the role of the grieving widow anymore. She was taking advantage of the situation, hoping I wouldn't fight back. And it hit me like a ton of bricks. This wasn't just about property or money, it was about power. She wanted control over everything, and she thought I'd let her take it. The more I thought about it, the more my anger began to turn into something else. A plan. I couldn't just let Janet get away with this, not after everything she had already taken from me. I started keeping an eye on her, watching her behavior closely. It was like she thought she had already won, and in some ways, she had. But what she didn't know was that I was playing a different game now, one where I was going to come out on top. It all started with small things. I began paying closer attention to the documents she was always carrying around, anything that seemed out of place. I made sure to drop by the lawyer's office more often, asking casual questions, pretending like I was just another grieving family member. But I wasn't. I was there to get information, to find any cracks in Janet's strategy, and to figure out how I could use the system to my advantage. Then one afternoon, I found the first real lead. I was at the house, going through some old boxes that Dad had left in the attic, looking for any personal mementos. As I went through them, I came across a folder with Dad's handwritten notes in it. It was a collection of all the things he'd planned for his estate, including detailed notes on the house and its future. My heart raced as I read through the pages. He had been meticulous in making sure everything was clear. There was a note about a secondary will, one that hadn't been revealed to anyone else, including Janet. My dad had made provisions in the case that someone tried to contest his wishes. I didn't know how Janet had pulled it off, but she clearly had no idea this backup document even existed. I held onto that folder like it was a treasure map. I knew that if I played my cards right, this could be the key to taking everything back. But first, I had to find out how far Janet's influence had stretched. I needed to know who was in her corner and who was just a pawn in her game. That's when I decided to dig into the legal side of things more seriously. The lawyer who had worked with Dad had always been someone we both trusted, but I wasn't so sure now. I called him up under the pretense of needing to ask some questions about Dad's estate, but I was really trying to figure out how much he knew about Janet's manipulations. When I asked about the will, his response was quick, almost too quick. He assured me that everything was in order, but there was a hesitation in his voice that I couldn't ignore. I made a mental note to dig deeper into his involvement. Maybe he was just too willing to go along with Janet's demands. But then the turning point came when I overheard a conversation I wasn't supposed to hear. I had gone to the local diner where Janet often met with her lawyer, someone I recognized as a business associate of hers. They were seated in the back booth, speaking in low voices, but it didn't take much to overhear the conversation. Janet was discussing her plans to sell the house as soon as she could legally take control. The lawyer was advising her on how to cover up the trail, how to make it look like Dad's finances were less stable than they really were. They even discussed forging a few documents to make everything appear legitimate. My blood boiled as I listened. But that's when I knew. Janet was in way over her head, and she thought she was invincible. She thought she had everything wrapped up. But what she didn't realize was that I had all the evidence I needed. I wasn't just going to let her get away with this anymore. I took a step back and started planning. First, I had to make sure she would never see this coming. I started meeting with the lawyer Dad had trusted, making sure he understood that I wasn't going to be the quiet, passive daughter she thought I was. I took the notes I had found in the attic, the ones Dad had written, and I prepared to confront Janet with them. She was going to get everything she deserved, and she wouldn't see it coming. I also began gathering information on her finances. If she thought she could buy her way into controlling everything, she had another thing coming. She'd been reckless with money, living beyond her means, and I was going to make sure that played a part in her downfall. The more I gathered, the more I realized how much power I had. Janet had thought she could simply manipulate the system and take everything from me. But I wasn't the same person I was when Dad was alive. I had learned from him how to read people, how to spot a weakness, and most importantly, how to make sure I had the upper hand when it mattered. Everything was falling into place. It was only a matter of time before Janet's perfect little plan came crashing down. It all came to a head at the family gathering. Janet had invited everyone over, claiming it was a final farewell to the house and a chance for us to close that chapter. But I knew what was really happening. She was trying to set the stage to sell the property to make it seem like everything was already decided, like the house was no longer mine to inherit. I could feel the tension in the air when I walked into the living room. Janet was sitting on the couch, smiling with that fake, comforting grin of hers, chatting away with distant relatives, trying to maintain the image of a grieving widow who was just doing what she had to do. It made my skin crawl. But today, I wasn't the quiet daughter who just went along with things. Today, I had the power, and I was going to use it. I took a deep breath and walked to the center of the room. Everyone stopped talking. Janet's smile faltered as she saw the documents I was holding. Dad's handwritten notes, the backup will, everything. I could see her eyes shift nervously, but she quickly regained her composure, acting like nothing was wrong. "I think it's time we talk about what's really going on here, Janet," I said, my voice steady, but my heart was pounding in my chest. The room fell silent. All eyes were on me. She scoffed, pretending to laugh. "What's this all about? You're making a scene." I shook my head, not backing down. "No, I'm not. You are. You're the one who tried to take everything from me. Everything my dad worked for." I held up the first document, the one that showed how she'd been working with the lawyer to manipulate the estate, the one that proved she was planning on selling the house behind my back. "I don't think you realized, but I found the backup will, the one my dad made in case something like this happened. It's clear as day. The house, the assets, everything is mine, not yours." Janet's face drained of color. She took a step back, trying to regain control of the room. But it was too late. The truth was out there, and the family wasn't going to buy her act anymore. "You can't do this," she said, her voice cracking. "You're just a little girl who doesn't understand how things work. Your dad was too emotional when he wrote those documents. This is how it's supposed to be." I didn't let her finish. "You've been playing this game for too long, Janet. You thought I wouldn't fight back. But you underestimated me. You lied, you manipulated, and you thought you could get away with it. Well, you're wrong." The lawyer she had been working with was standing in the corner, looking uncomfortably at the ground. I turned to him next. "You were in on this too, weren't you? Helping her forge documents, advising her to sell the house. How much did she pay you to keep quiet?" The lawyer looked around, clearly flustered. I didn't. You knew what she was doing and you let her do it. You thought you could pull one over on me, on my dad's legacy," I said, voice rising. "But the truth is here, in black and white. And now everyone knows exactly what's been going on." I took a step back and let the silence hang in the air for a few moments. I could see Janet's face, flushed with panic now. The facade she'd built was crumbling, and it felt so damn good to watch. But the best part? She wasn't going to be able to fix it. She couldn't talk her way out of this one. "I'm going to the authorities," I said, my voice cold. "I've already sent the evidence to the proper people. If you try to sell the house, if you try to claim anything else, I'll make sure they find out what you've done. You'll never get away with it." Janet's face twisted with rage, but there was a clear panic in her eyes. She knew it was over. Her entire plan, her manipulation, her lies, her grip on everything was slipping through her fingers. "You don't know what you're doing. You'll regret this," she spat, but I could see the desperation in her tone. I stood tall, looking her right in the eyes. "I don't think I will." The room was silent as Janet stood there, stunned. She had nothing left to say. She had lost, and everyone knew it. The aftermath of that day was swift and honestly a bit surreal. Janet tried, of course, to fight back. She tried to tell anyone who would listen that I was being unreasonable, that I was a spoiled child trying to take everything from her. But the problem with lies is that they fall apart the moment you have the truth on your side. The lawyer, who had initially been complicit, was the first to turn on her. He knew he was in too deep, and when the authorities got involved, it didn't take long for them to realize that Janet had been operating well outside the law. It didn't help her case when people started coming forward with their own stories. How she had been hiding assets, manipulating financial statements, and pushing for things that she knew weren't legally hers to take. I could see her crumbling under the pressure. She had thought she was untouchable, that she could pull the wool over everyone's eyes. But the truth was, she had never really known what it was like to face consequences, not until now. As for the house, it was officially recognized as mine. My dad's will was upheld, and with all the legal battles behind me, I was able to start moving forward. I put the house on the market eventually, but not because I had to. I didn't need to sell it to get back at Janet. I didn't need to do anything more. I sold it because I was ready to move on, to start fresh, and to leave behind the memories of a family that had betrayed me. Janet's life, on the other hand, completely fell apart. She lost the house, of course, but she also lost the trust of everyone who had ever supported her. People who had once thought of her as a strong, independent woman began to see her for what she really was, a manipulative, greedy person willing to destroy anyone in her path to get what she wanted. She tried to start over somewhere else, but the damage was done. No one wanted to work with her anymore, no one wanted to trust her, and before long she was left with nothing. The worst part for her was realizing she had no one left. My dad had always been her biggest ally, and without him, she had no foundation. She'd alienated all the people who could have helped her, and in the end, she had no choice but to watch as everything she'd worked for came crashing down. She even tried calling me a few times, but I ignored every message. There was no fixing what had been broken. I didn't care about her anymore. Honestly, after everything that happened, I didn't care about the house, the money, or the power I had over her. What I cared about was the satisfaction of knowing I had stood my ground and taken back what was rightfully mine. What I cared about was reclaiming the peace I'd lost when my dad passed. That was the real victory. As for me, I moved forward with my life. I started fresh, and for the first time in a long time, I felt free. No more looking over my shoulder. No more wondering if someone was trying to take what was mine. I knew my dad would be proud of how I handled everything, and that was all I needed. Janet? Well, she's a footnote in my life now. Someone who tried to take what wasn't hers and failed. The last time I heard about her, she was living in a small apartment, working a job that barely paid her bills, and I couldn't care less. She'd lost everything, and I had won, not just the house, but my peace of mind. I wasn't angry anymore. I was in control.